Testing. Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. My test. My test 1, 2, 3.
Okay, we decide. Is it on? Yeah. It's okay. We've decided not to punish you further, but to wait for others to come. We'll just get started. Yeah. Now, Dr. Michael Shaper contacted me through a common friend a few months ago to discuss the idea of productivity, and a concept that I actually am quite interested in for various reasons. And so we started talking about how that concept can be enhanced and can direct policy thinking, and perhaps bridge discussions across cities, countries, continents even, right? Well, that discussion has so far led to us having Michael here today as our guest to begin that dialogue. Some of my researchers are here today because I wish for them to join in this discussion at an early stage. Not many of them turned up, so well, that's how it is with evening events sometimes. Now I will try not to start a discussion before Michael himself does that. So I'll not say some of the things I do want to say, other than to perhaps touch on why I and we think the term productivity is important. I think that in many developing countries that went from maybe half feudal economy and so on to a modern economy, we should not imagine that all the important concepts were there. They came suddenly in. And during dinner, we were talking about how countries, especially countries that rely a lot on natural products, tend not to develop the work ethics that fit factory workers, if we put it that way. Well, productivity, as it were. So the state itself does not think of income through social productivity or social economic productivity, but through rent seeking, through raising taxes, through putting tolls, and so on and so forth. So today we'll talk about something that Australia is very much into, Productivity Commission. And to me, that sounds interesting because there is a strong heuristic function in there, right? It's not just any old commission. It's also a commission that brings a certain way of thinking about economics into the picture. So let's welcome Michael Shaper to Penang Institute and to Penang. He's been to Penang many times. He's eaten all the street food we have to offer, and so welcome. And I hope you come back again so we can continue this discussion. Thank you.
Terima kasih. Thank you. This is, well, there's a set of slides. We might just put them up one by one if we can. This is not a discussion about productivity per se or just productivity on itself. It's actually talking tonight. I'm happy to have a little bit of discussion, and I think Data would probably be happy to join me in that debate as well. I'm very happy to consider some of those issues, but really talking about how do we institutionalise, or how can we ensure that as a community, as a society, how can we ensure that our government and our systems of bureaucracy, our systems of managing ourselves, take into account not only some of the issues about higher productivity, but also about thinking about some of the aspects of the future. How's that? Better? How's that? Yep. Is that clear enough? Freddie, down the back? Great. Excellent. William, that good? Yep. Great. And the Australian experiment, which has been over the last almost 30 years now, to actually build, as you can see from behind me, a series of productivity commissions into many of their levels of government, starting with our federal government, and in more recent years also applying that at states as well. So I'm going to talk primarily in the first instance about what a productivity commission is. As a number of writers have pointed out, this is very much, although it is now found in several countries around the world, it's very common in parts of the European Union. There's one in the United Kingdom. There are other models operating around the world. It is very much born out of the Australian experience. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that and why there might be some value in it, how it works, what it does, the sort of issues it addresses, and then also look at the topic about, I think a really interesting question that the data and I have been thinking about is that aspect about, can it also apply at a state level as well? It's one thing for national governments to say they're concerned about these issues, but as you'll see tonight, it's also been the case that many times state governments, especially in federations like Malaysia, like Australia, have also said, we want to be in charge of our own economic performance, and so we're going to set up frameworks like this as well. So that's what I'll run through briefly tonight. I'm very happy to take questions either as we go or at the end, or just read the room and see how it goes, but feel free to speak up when you want to do so. And I'll try to keep it short and concise for you all. So if you're looking here for a detailed discussion on the ins and outs of Malaysia or even Penang's productivity performance, that's not what we're covering. What we are covering is much more a discussion about how do we embed a way of thinking about productivity into what we do as a society and what our government does as well. And what are the big issues that we should also be seeking to address? So, often the phrase a productivity commission is referred to as a PC. I put this one up here just to make the point, we're not talking about personal computers here. We're talking about a statutory independent arm of government whose purpose it is to provide information about productivity performance, to objectively examine issues affecting productivity, economic performance, and making recommendations to government about how that might be improved. If you want to think about it in a very general sense, it's almost like having your own in-house government think tank. And as you'll see in a minute, that also poses interesting questions for bodies like the Penang Institute, which is in itself, amongst other things, a think tank anyway. So am I suggesting just the same thing all over again? I think there's a few differences, but let me give you a bit of background before we get to that point as well. So a productivity commission, as you can see here, is basically, as I said before, a body that Parliament legislates for, whose role it is to inquire, usually as directed by government, but sometimes in many places off its own back, into some of the fundamental economic and sometimes also more than just economic, sometimes also the social issues of the day, and to make detailed recommendations back to government. In most places, those recommendations have to be either answered, they don't have to be taken up by government, but governments are usually also in turn required public response to that. Yes, we agree, no, we don't, or that's very interesting, we'll think about it, or whatever. But it does come with a measure of accountability as opposed to, this is not something that's done behind closed doors, it's something that's done very publicly. Even the whole process of examining the issues, airing different views, and seeing what the alternatives are, is all done in a public forum and is made public both during the process and at the end of it as well. What you've got up there behind you on this slide is just an extract from the very first legislated productivity commission in the world, and this is the Federal Productivity Commission Act in Australia, close to now 30 years ago or so. Despite its name, a productivity commission isn't just an economic body. It isn't just looking at solely gross state product, gross domestic product, per capita dollars and cents, and all those other sort of quantifiable measurements. Increasingly, as a body responsible, as I said before, I use the phrase a bit of a think tank, inquiring into some of the big issues of the day on behalf of government. It increasingly is not just about economic, but it's also, as you can see there, about environmental issues, it's about social issues, it's about community issues. And of course, if you think about it, in a sense, that should not be surprising because ultimately, all those things are bound up together anyway. So whether it be the cost of land degradation, whether it be the cost of an ageing society, for example, which is one of the hot button issues, for example, that the Institute has been looking at in a little bit more detail here. But what it is doing is making sure that we get all the ideas from around the community and not just a small amount of them, so that when governments do make a decision, they actually have the full picture and all the details about how it could or could not be implemented in front of them. So here's a couple of things that, for example, the colleagues in Australia have looked at in different times, and they're not dissimilar. There's a very similar list you could have if you were to look at, for example, Europe and a number of other areas as well. There's quite an extensive list of nations around the world doing this. Malaysia is not one of them, and in fact, there is no other productivity commission in Southeast Asia at the moment, although there are some things that are a little bit similar to it. So you can see that the shopping list here is fairly extensive. Workforce training and needs. What do we need? How do we predict the right number of workers? How do we make sure we get the right number of workers in particular fields? How do we deal with the side effects of an ageing, longer living society that is spending more time and energy focusing on the so-called care economy? Mental health issues, suicide issues there. How, at the same time, we're also becoming a society with a great deal more of digitalisation in every aspect of our life. So how do we actually make sure that we use that both in an economic and a social sense as well? So you can see there a whole range of lists: decarbonisation, AI, the list goes on. These are some other ones that are a little bit more detailed, but ones where we often need to think a little bit more about how do we actually make this work. For example, how do we ensure that the private health sector is operating efficiently in the country? Are we using our hospitals effectively? Are there better ways to do this? Is the medical workforce being trained appropriately? Interesting one there at the top, as you can see there, about tax and biodiversity. Are the economic incentives to save our natural assets and features actually appropriate for where we are? How do we ensure that we actually get people being willing to move from one occupation to another? And on and on. So there's a whole host of things. In fact, the sky is the limit in terms of the topics that you might want to think about that can be examined as well. So, but the first question is, why would you have one? Okay, it's going to cost you money. It's going to take time. It's going to take effort. And as I said before, there are other places that do this, or at least put forward ideas as well. Let me come back to this one in a second, but have a look at this at the moment. We're in a world full of crowded ideas. There is no shortage of people who want to give us their opinion about how to make things better. Some of those are really well-developed ideas. Some of them are rants on social media. Some of them are highly complex projects people have spent years investing effort on. But whether we're talking about things such as the KPMGs and the Price Waterhouses and the Deloittes of the world coming up with ideas basically on demand, whether we're talking about university research papers and academic outputs, whether we're talking about some of the opinion pieces and some of the thought leadership that comes out of things like Penang Monthly, then you can also see that this is not the only place. So why would we bother to actually spend government dollars, your tax dollars, to actually go and set one of these up as well? Well, there's a couple of reasons why. Do you want to have just a quick thing? When we see research that's commissioned, for example, by consultancies, or put forward by, for example, industry associations or something, does anyone ever ask the question in the back of the mind, how balanced is this piece of evidence that I've been given? Or is it a survey that's just been given to me, or a piece of information because it's come with a particular perspective or a particular agenda that it's trying to push? No, see, there's no harm in that. It's an important part of a democratic society. But what we do need to remember is that often the research that comes out of other organisations doesn't answer all the questions. Sometimes it's because it's got a vested interest in it. It's got, for example, it comes out, it's been put forward in order to propagate a particular policy outcome. Sometimes it's also lacking in detail as to how did you come to this conclusion? What's the proof? Can you show us the proof as to why this is a problem and how it might be solved? And also, where's the public benefit for it as well? Where is the, what's in it for the general community? Because most people don't speak up when these things come out. It's only a small section of the community. So the idea of a productivity commission is to ensure that it's an impartial body that looks at these issues, not taking any one of these perspectives, but rather is actually trying to do it in a more objective fashion as well. So that would probably be, I think, a really important piece to look at it. I mean, a really short answer, if you ever read an opinion piece in an op-ed in a newspaper or even a social media post, very rarely do you get a large amount of detailed information come out of it about why. What you do get is someone's thoughts and views. Fair enough, but it ain't the right way necessarily to develop a public policy response or for governments to commit money to solving the problem. So the difference with the Productivity Commission is that, as you can see here, there's a couple of elements done here. First of all, it often seeks to actually do it in a way that actually is compatible with, does government actually want to know the answer to the problem? In many cases, reviews are only done after government's asked someone to look into the issue. Should we have a disability scheme should we have a disability insurance scheme to protect people suffering from disabilities? If so, how do we make it work? That's something, for example, that came about in Australia because a federal minister wanted to know whether or not it would be viable to actually create such a scheme as that. So first of all, it's got to have at least a commitment from government that they'll look at the issue seriously rather than just be thrown up. A second one is that wherever possible, let's try and get some real information, some real data and local data. And if we can't, then let's go out and get it. Let's get the objective evidence. What often tends to happen, of course, is that it's easy, for example, to get national data, but it's hard to get local data. Statistics Malaysia, for example, just like the one I'm most familiar with, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, they collect data, usually on a national level, don't always break it down into the context of your own community. But the third one I think is really important is that if you want to make a change, how are you actually going to do it? What's it going to cost? Who is going to make the change? How are you going to make the change? And that is probably one of the big differences, because often it's very easy to make suggestions that the government ought to fix this problem. We have a problem here, you need to fix it. The next question is how? Who's going to do it and how? And so because you're working from within the system, you should be expected to be able to come up and say, this is how the system needs to deal with or fix the problem, rather than just a pie-in-the-sky general notion. And finally, it should also try and rise above the day-to-day party politics and also be something that all sides of politics in a parliament and part of the broader community feel is actually being done in a non-partisan way, so that there's hopefully, everyone's had the chance to express their views, and hopefully the outcome is one that represents most views. Not always possible to get all views, but at least most of them as well. Here's a couple of examples, of course, of just what I was talking about there. These are actually just shamelessly taken off the website from earlier this afternoon, but I think they're really good examples of here where things are big issues are being tackled. For example, the issue about ageing and how do we deal with an increasingly elderly society. It's a very, very common issue, and it's only going to get more significant right around the globe. How do we deal with it? How do we deal with things like online scammers? How do we actually ensure that, for example, the idea of actually removing children's access to social media and to digital tools and the benefits of a better developed childhood experience? How do we actually do that as opposed to just saying we ought to do it, for example? How do we fix up scams? Is that a question? You've got to... No, that's okay. If you've got a question, jump in though, please. Feel free to do so. Sorry. So looking at those in a little bit more detail, for example, if we're going to deal with aged care, who is going to deal with aged care and how are they going to do it? And an important one, how much is it going to cost? Is anyone actually, it's very easy to sort of say we should fix something, much harder for someone to go, and what do you think that would cost us? Someone's got to put a flag in the ground and start making some estimates about what they are. So this is often the big challenge. Think tank members, academic researchers often don't have access to the detailed information that would allow them to actually get to the nub of it. And in many cases, because they're not part of the bureaucracy, also don't have the capacity sometimes to actually identify this is the best way, best part of the machinery of government to address this issue. So it doesn't mean a productivity commission can't take academic research and inquiry into account, but it needs to go one step further. That's probably the other thing. Non-partisan, talk about the money, talk about the actual detailed implementation. They're the big things there. So I mentioned before that some of these have been done right around the country. Well, here is a list of productivity commissions in Australia, and I'll show you briefly in a minute also some international ones. In Australia, 5 of the 8 states and territories now have their own productivity commission, as well as I said before, the federal one. The federal one's been around since '98. The other ones have been around for about the last 10 years. And so there's no reason why other jurisdictions can't think about that. And indeed, if you were to go to for example, the European Union, you would find there's a large number of member countries in the European Union that have also, or the EC, sorry, 20 out of the 27 member states there that already have their own productivity commissions. And then other countries as well, Chile, for example. The OECD is increasingly focused on that. And interestingly, New Zealand did for a while, and then they closed it down, which is an interesting story in itself as well. In the UK as well is another one. So these things are increasingly taking a bit of a foothold, and it's probably one to think about: do we want to get on the bandwagon as well? So where did the Australian one come from? Let me just give you a couple of quick bits about this, and then I will just show you some of the big issues that are worth tackling in the future, and then I think we'll throw it open for some discussion as well. Dato' Oi made the comment earlier that both Malaysia and Australia, as well as being federations, are also countries that over the years have, some economists would say blessed and some would say cursed, in having strong resources bases. For example, famously tin, rubber and a whole host of other resources here, especially in the early days of the federated Malaysian states and much later right through after independence as well. And Australia still has a similar sort of base there in a whole range of both agricultural and mineral resources. Sometimes it's called the old Dutch disease, is a phrase that might be familiar to some people, which is the curse that happens when countries can rely on their resources rather than on their people or their own economic adaptability. And so what you see in the Australian example, I've used this one here, is that it took us about, 70 or 80 years to kind of work out that we should stop supporting, just throwing money at industries and actually work out how do we actually make them work more effectively. So like many parts of the world, and I feel like Donald Trump going back here, 1921, we had a system of tariffs in place. And then over time realised that after 60 years, that wasn't really actually, putting up tariff walls didn't actually produce better economic outcomes for the country. So we moved to actually targeted assistance for some industries, and then over time to a more generalised one about how do we make industry work, not only how do we support it, but how do we make it work more effectively, more productively, more efficiently. And ultimately that led to what was originally, as you can see, a creature that had been created to subsidise industries, regardless of how inefficient they might have been, to one that became an entity that was actually in 1998 turned around completely to actually say, how do we make them the most efficient they can be as well? So this is a similar story to many countries. We go through time in terms of trying to work out, do we protect our industries? Do we put walls up? Do we impose costs on our own local consumers? Or if we open up to the rest of the world, how do we do it to make sure that we can do it successfully and ensure that businesses can survive as well? I'm just going to jump to a couple of other points here. So the key things there are an independent body, one that has, as I said before, a clear amount of evidence, one that has open hearings, one that has public inquiries, and one that actually publishes its outcomes and its results and the evidence on which it's made its decisions, again, out there in the public domain, so that everyone, parliamentarians, ministers, public servants, interested members of the community, business groups, community groups, social services sector, can all see what is proposed and whether it does or doesn't work as well. I mentioned a couple of, let me just move to a recent trend also that I just want to touch on before I throw open to a couple of questions as well. And if anyone wants copies of the slides, by the way, I'm very happy for them to be made available as well. So if that's of value as well. So I have the good fortune at the moment to be the acting chair of the latest Productivity Commission in Australia, which is the one in Western Australia. It's a state, like I said, it's incredibly resource rich. It is at one stage the value of its mining per annum was greater than the US exports to China, which goes to show you that it's got a fairly wealthy base, but at the same time still asks itself, are we actually working as effectively as we could be, or do we need to plan a little bit more for the day the mining runs out, or the day in which, as we all know, circumstances change and we can no longer rely on one or two purchases of raw materials to sustain us as well. In Western Australia, they've chosen to call it, that's a picture of our state premier, a 2050 commission, and it's actually meant to have a threefold model. It's not only meant to look at productivity, but it's also meant to look, put a lens over what's being done in particular industries, what are state government departments doing to develop those industries, fisheries, wheat, space, technology, a fair bit of submarine building there, there's maritime and shipping, there's a whole host of light manufacturing and information technology. Is that being done, and is state money being used effectively on there? So that's one thing. This is more than just traditional productivity, as you can see there at the bottom of the list. And it's also been targeted to look at major infrastructure developments, over 200 million Australian, which would be about 500 million ringgit or thereabouts in the Malaysian currency conversion. So industry development, is it being done properly? Infrastructure, is the right sort of infrastructure being built for the future? Roads, railways, hospitals, public services, and then, as I just mentioned, also the economic efficiency and a number of other issues in terms of traditional productivity reviews. Just 2 or 3 slides, and then Dado, I'll pass over to you if you want to take questions there about it. A couple of things you need to think about when you are trying to work out how do we come up with new ideas, and also when you do set up a commission, you're going to have this funny body that sits within government but is meant to be independent. It's a bit like having a court system or an ombudsman or a number of other arms of government where, yes, you are part of and funded by the public purse, but you are expected to stand separate to the day-to-day political pressures that almost inevitably, indeed they always do emerge, about what are you going to suggest? Governments don't like people coming up with ideas and kind of going, oh, and now I have to explain why I won't take that on board, or yes, that's a really good idea, but it runs counter to a whole bunch of vested interests that support me as a parliamentarian. How do I deal with that? So independence for a productive commission is really important. It is not easy always to do. I mentioned before about the idea that you do have to actually be able to put down some estimates about if you're going to suggest a change of action, how much is it going to cost and who's going to pay for it. But the other one is that some of the big issues of the day are highly contentious. For example, carbon reduction and the whole movement to reducing greenhouse gases, but also our impact on them. Do we charge a tax on it? Do we force people into emissions reductions? Do we subsidise their changes? And in some parts of the world, of course, those issues aren't taken as politically. For example, you think about the United States today, there's a very large amount of American politics that just does not believe in greenhouse gases and does not believe in the need to decarbonise and thinks, was it burn those fuels, baby, burn? And there's a whole half of the other country that does. So how do you tread the fine line between that? How do you raise issues? It requires a pretty careful sense of understanding the politics and not getting caught up in the party politics of it. And you can fall foul of that very easily. Some of the other issues you need to think about if you're setting one up is, who do you answer to? If you're a state body, do you answer to the state premier? Do you answer to the state treasurer? Do you answer to a more junior minister whose views in the cabinet room may not actually carry much weight in terms of getting any real change through? Do you get given enough money? Do you get given enough staff to actually do the work? And do you actually can you find the right people to actually do this sort of work? It's intellectually very interesting because you're jumping around from one subject to another, day in, day out. But that requires, it's almost a hybrid of someone with strong academic skills, but also an understanding about public policy and a more nuanced view about also how the bureaucracy works and how you can make things work within it. So almost someone who's got three sets of skills, not one. Not always that easy to find either. And finally, I looked about what are the big issues. This is, I thought this is a really interesting one. Anyone who's got to think about sense of economics, of course, will think I just mentioned about a productivity commission will also always worry about things like, are we setting the right regulatory framework? Are we, or should we be spending money on supporting particular industries? If so, which ones? How much should we give them? Why? What will we get out of it? Those things, as I said, they're perennial. They're things that happen all the time. Sorry, I'll pop back to this. There you go. But I made. Actually, I'm just back. How's that? Better? Yeah. Sorry, I got carried away there. And then I made a list on the right-hand side, and I've made this one for ourselves in Australia. And then I looked at it and realised that kind of almost everything that's in there applies almost equally to everyone in this room as well. How do we deal with an ageing society? The perpetual challenge about how do we diversify our economy. Every economy is always trying to do something like that. Doesn't matter whether it's somewhere like Singapore that's got 25 different projects on the boil at once, or whether it's a heavily resource-laden economy. We're always trying to think about how do we secure the future. How do we deal with digital challenges? And you can see the rest of the list on there as well. So it doesn't matter where we are, what country we're in, or what time frame. I think these are issues that all of us need to think about, but sometimes we also need someone whose day job it is to make sure that they're thinking not only about raising these issues, but also suggesting ways forward so that we can help deal with them. If we don't take the old line about the future, if you don't actually, life is what happens to you while you're busy making other plans. John Lennon once wrote that in one of his songs, but it's so true. If we don't actually actively seek to formulate our own future and our own agenda, the future will take care of it for us, but it may not be what we want. So there is a role for these, I think, in the emerging face of public policy in all countries going forward. I might stop at that point. For those of you who are academically inclined, of course, it wouldn't be the same with our list of references at the end. So for those who actually want to know a little bit more, but if anyone is wanting to know a little bit more about how these work and some of the other related aspects, I'm very happy to do so. My contact details are on the very first page of this set of slides. And as I said, I'm very happy for those to be made available either on your website or however else you might want to distribute them if people want them. Dado, I might stop at that point and throw it open for questions. If that's all right with you. Yeah, I'll leave it to you to moderate. Yes. Whoops. Go on.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Well, for me, what was extra interesting about what you were saying was, as you remember when we started discussing this, I wasn't quite sure what a productivity commission was. So thanks for explaining that. But look, going through your explanation, I was thinking from the point of view of Penang itself, not Malaysia, but Penang. Well, we almost have it.
Yes.
It's that we look at the whole public policy making network in Penang itself. If the agencies work more closely together, and if all of their discussions were more centralized and perhaps placed within the chief minister's office, we have it already, right? So I suppose that's not so strange because a lot of policy making requires a lot of the things that you mentioned. So that, thanks for that. So to me, it's like, well, I've been trying to get, people to connect more, the agencies to connect more, and this is already happening all over the world. That this is how you look at things. It's somewhat more top down than we are used to.
Yeah.
The system we have it's built up from below to some extent, and in the end, you have trouble. I'm glad you pointed out that the public sector reforms or productivity, you call it, that is also a problem here. I'm sure it's a problem all over the world, right? And once we have, the internet and so on, it becomes even a bigger problem in that we can see solutions to the lack of productivity in the public sector. All this can be solved, but then the lethargy and the resistance to that leap is of course very strong. Having said that, one last thing before I let everyone else ask questions. There is actually an initiative going on in Parliament, Malaysian Parliament, to start the Malaysian Productivity Commission. It's actually in the works and it's actually on the list, it's queuing. It hasn't come into Parliament yet. This came out of the Trade Commission, the Ministry of Trade and Investment. So it's all laid out. Recently, someone sent me the text itself, but it hasn't passed yet. So I think we're on the way to that. It's sort of having, am I right in simplifying it in such a way that if the Chief Minister, in our case, or the Prime Minister, has a think tank right in his office that has a certain authority to manage policy, that would be your productivity commission?
I think it is. How's that? Yep, got that there. So a couple of questions in there, but to answer the last one first. If it was in, for example, the Chief Minister's office or the Prime Minister's office, yes. I think the critical element is to make sure that it has a degree of independence of thought, and independence of response. Otherwise, its credibility, but also its capacity to actually generate answers that may not be what the government of the day is necessarily expecting as the answer, that you still need that as well. But sitting in and answering to either a Premier or to a Treasurer, or Chief Minister or Treasurer or the head of government, whatever level we're talking about, is fairly important in terms of actually ensuring that whatever a commission deals with is taken seriously. So you're quite right there. And I would agree with you. I think the Penang Institute is a long way along there. There are one or two of those elements that I showed that I think are still probably to come, but it's probably much further than most other parts of government. You mentioned the national bill as well. Indonesia is also looking at a similar model as well. Like many of the other institutional frameworks, competition agencies, anti-corruption commissions, these are parts of a whole suite of institutional frameworks that governments in the region are looking at. And for all of them, again, that issue about capacity to exercise judgment is really important, so that it has credibility in the public eye as well. So yeah, so I think it is a long way. What has been interesting is that for Penang, I think the chance to actually sort of say, we also want to be looking at these things. We're not going to just wait for the federal government to decide things for us. We will actively manage where we want to go. It will be can be a very, very valuable asset to have.
Thank you. Before I open to the floor, one comment to what you're saying about independence, right? Of course, there's always a central issue.
Yeah.
But of course, when the show of independence, whether the show of independence should be public or private, is a big question. Now, in our experience at Penang Institute, we are not part of the government. We just act like we are, and we are often treated as part of that. And so our opposition is usually behind locked doors, as it were. And I do think we do have quite a lot of independence, but we don't oppose the government publicly. In that sense, we are not an NGO of that type, right? That I think is an important point. And of course, if you're not independent institutionally, if you're part of the government, if you're part of the public service itself, then independence becomes something else.
It's a very fine balancing act. And most of the issues of the day that you might deal with are never done publicly. They're done behind closed doors. For example, I have an issue here, or we think this might be problematic. Interestingly enough, for a lot of productivity commissions, it's setting the terms of reference for an inquiry that is often where and that is usually done, for example, by the responsible minister, say the chief minister, handing down, I want you to examine this issue and do an inquiry into this subject and produce a report with recommendations. It's the testing of that and the developing of that, which is often the point at which it becomes really clear whether or not there's likely to be a very strong difference of view. And most of that is done within the internal processes of government, so it doesn't really come out. Which is not to say it's sanitised, but rather that it is more carefully thought out. So the people who run the organisations are really important to their success. Get someone who wants to pick fights, you're not going to last. But so you need someone that's a critical friend is probably the right phrase. Right. A critical friend of government. Sometimes I need to say something you might not like, but I'm not here to make your life hard. I'm just trying to point out you could do better. But most of the time it will be, here is a suggestion, and we think you can do it.
And also, I suppose the critical fringe survives at the mercy of the chief minister or the prime minister, right?
Yes, that is always true.
Yeah, so you need it depends on the attitude or the character of the leader himself for such a thing to develop, I suppose. I'll open the floor now to anyone who has anything to ask. Xiaowen?
Thank you very Right, test. Thank you very much. I just have to pick up from what you mentioned just now, also some of your presentation that you mentioned that the commission is a statutory sort of allowance that this is being set up in Australia, and you can have certain ministry requests for inquiries to be made. Yeah. So how is that different from, say, for example, like the Auditors General's work? Right? How do you draw that line? Because in Malaysia, we have the MPC, Malaysian Productivity Corporation, that they cover mostly and reply mostly to the Ministry of MITI, Investment and Trade. MITI, right. So how would that commission function, productivity commission function? Do they sit under one specific ministry, or it's across all board, Or how do you draw that line between a public inquiry, for example, which in Malaysia, the auditors general would answer most of that question in parliament? How do you draw that line? I'm just trying to make things clear. Thank you.
An auditor, for example, let's just use the example of an auditor general. Often that's reporting back against legal requirements in terms of have you been compliant with, for example, disbursement of monies or other accountability tools that exist. So an easy way to think about how is this different is that it's exploring what might the future look like if we were to try and fix ... problem, if we were to try and solve a particular issue. So it's not so much, so the very fundamental issue is it's not a compliance check, are you doing what you're meant to be doing? It is much more about we have a problem or a future problem, let's map it out, let's work out the full dimensions of change that's coming and how can we prepare for that? So it's much more future oriented and a little more vague because the future, by definition, will never be fully known. We can only make our best guess at it. Or it could be, so it's either a future problem or it's an existing problem which no one else has yet been able to either put forward as a workable solution about how to deal with it. So, for example, the ageing issues is a critical one as well. It does require generally a commitment from departments, and that's why it often needs a chief minister to be the accountable minister in order to make sure that all the arms of government will provide the information or support that's needed. Because if it was the commission were to answer to a much more junior, less important minister, I'm sure you'd end up with roadblocks where people say, oh, we don't have time to give you that information, or sometimes we're just not going to give it to you, because you actually need both the responsible departments, but there'll be other arms of government sometimes too that you need to ask their view or how they fit into it.
Sort of depends where the PC sits in the bureaucracy itself.
Yeah.
It has to sit very high up, not at the top at least, parallel to.
All of the Australian ones sit at either the Chief Minister or Prime Minister, depending on what level it is, or the Treasurer. None of them go below that level.
Okay.
So it's either typically the first or second ranked member of government.
I suppose in Malaysia you have had attempts at that, right? The EPU perhaps in the Prime Minister's office. But then they tend to deal largely with economic matters. But what you're saying is that this is governance, really. So although it's called productivity, it's actually governance efficacy that is its main issue, isn't it?
And there are, and there are some issues, of course, like the efficiency of the public service itself. That's a really great one, and of course you can just imagine the response you're going to get with that if you were to do an inquiry into that. So you certainly do need an indication that the government is serious about tackling the problem. Otherwise, why bother try and deal with it? Because it's just not going to get anywhere as well. Some governments' labour relations will be that's often an important issue in terms of economic performance, but it's also got a very strongly political element because labour laws, labour relations are often tightly tied into the political process as well.
One question that comes to me now is, so do members of the PC come and go with the Prime Minister? Or is it so much a part of the public service that they're there, no matter the PM?
At the federal level, they are appointed for up to 5 years at a time. And in that case, the federal one is typically their full-time appointees. There's up to about 10 or 11 commissioners. The federal one is a very big creature. It's got 200 staff. It's got a big budget. State ones tend to be much smaller, typically, say, 2 or 3 commissioners, part-time, and a staff of 2 or 3, 20 to 30 staff. So much smaller in scope. They're not public, the commissioners are not public servants. So they, indeed, many of the reasons why they're part-time is because they have other jobs or other roles, so that they're not dependent on government for their livelihood, which gives them some degree of further independence as well.
So I'm sure some of them will come and go with the Prime Minister.
Yeah. Typically, to remove though, you need either a parliamentary vote or there are protection mechanisms. Federal level, you can't remove a commissioner without a vote of both houses of Parliament. So that's a pretty high bar. Yeah.
So their effective power is something that the boss, the Prime Minister, gives them, right? Because he can ignore them anyway.
Yeah. You can, That's a much easier way to deal with the problem. Just ignore it.
Unless they're your people, if they're not your people, you just ignore them.
Yeah.
So, okay. Any other question?
Hi, Michael. No, I just have a curious, because when you talk productivity, we always think of labor productivity, firms level productivity. So it's just about we mentioned about MPC Malaysia Productivity Corporation. So they and this MPC is fully focused on labor productivity. So two focus that we hardly hear from them. Occasionally they just publish some data, labor productivity. But when you look at your explanation just now, your productivity commission cover very widely, from aging, tariff, trade. Okay, so is your productivity commission focus on productivity of public sector or broader than this?
That's a good question. Okay, so I've shown you the federal one there. The closer to home, the state productivity commissions tend to focus on as directed by their government of the day. They tend to do, so some of them are very unashamedly, we want you to look at big, like in Queensland, we want you to look at big macroeconomic pictures. What's the efficiency of the housing and construction sector? Because we think it's a laggard. We think it's very inefficient. That's the government's view. In New South Wales, the productivity commissioner there is actually being asked to look at a whole series of very, very small microeconomic reforms. Land titles. Can we improve the system of land titles and land administration so as to make it easier for people to buy and sell property and to reduce the cost, the deadweight costs that go with it? So sometimes they can be very, very small. In Western Australia, because it's still in the throes of being finalised, some of that is, I think, an open question. There are some issues like energy that all of the states are struggling with, and it's become very clear that energy departments or energy bureaucracies aren't always able to provide the answers because they're already part of an existing regulatory regime. So sometimes that's a micro, that's not just a micro reform, that's a macro reform, really, energy in today's society all the way through. So it is, there is an element of horses for courses and some degree of evolution. And I guess that's probably why having a state entity can be useful, because states will have different needs and different problems and different challenges and different objectives. So being able to actually say, we would like you to focus on either micro reforms, or the name of the Western Australian model is the 2050 Commission. It's very clear about, we want you to think about the next 25 years, what our state economy will look like as we transition away from mining, for example. How do we do it? So, but you wouldn't get, as a state, you could not ask a federal body to do that, because you wouldn't, that would be your interest, not theirs. Yeah. So it is a very much, there's commonalities, but there's still very clear, obviously, differences there.
Well, I do also react the way you did to the word productivity use in this way, in that it sounds like a misnomer.
Yes.
So I wonder where did that word first come from? Because you're meaning something
It's
much
more,
very broad.
yeah.
Right?
And I do worry that sometimes you can end up being too broad, so that you're everything to everyone. The United Kingdom has put this focus on. They've got a productivity commission, and they talk about traditional drivers of economic productivity. You know, for example, technology, capital, skills, and training. But they also have this one called place-based productivity, and it's an argument that different parts of the country are inherently more productive than others, which is a really interesting notion, and I've got to explore that a little bit more further. And for them also, Scotland and Wales have wellness commissions, and their thing is about the quality of life. So they've almost kind of gone, productivity is part of it, but our core focus is you think of Scotland and Wales as kind of very big state governments, I guess, in a sense. You know, it's not a federation, of course, but they have their own, self-administered parliaments, and they've actually jumped to, we want you to focus on wellness, and that's a really interesting one because everyone defines wellness in a very different way. Try finding an objective set of indicators to measure that.
Yeah, I feel very well when I'm not forced to produce. You know. Any other question, Li Wei?
I wonder what is the powers or authority of this productivity commission? Like, do they like produce reports, and how well the government would act on it, or it would just be a report in 2005?
There's two sets of significant powers. I mentioned whether a report will be made public at the end, and that produces its own degree of accountability, because traditionally oppositions will ask a government, why haven't you responded to it? So that's an important one to try and have in the framework. The other one, though, is also the power to compel people to give you information when you're collecting it. So many of the productivity commissions with a legislative basis actually also have a requirement to be able to collect data from people with appropriate safeguards, especially if it's commercial in confidence. But nonetheless, we would like this information in order for us to be able to draw our conclusions. So that's a little bit more contentious. You've got to be quite careful about that. But nonetheless, it does exist. The Federal Productivity Commission has it, and a number of state ones do in Australia. I don't know about most of the other international ones.
Any other questions? William?
Oh, this was just a technical clarification, because I noticed in the list of references, some of the references were basically titled they were basically describing pro-productivity commissions. So I was wondering if there's a technical distinction between a productivity commission versus a pro-productivity commission.
I don't know. They've the titles keep moving around. You saw the Productivity Commission. You saw the 2050 Commission. Another state, it's actually called the Productivity and Equality Commission, which is an interesting one because economic efficiency isn't always the friend of equitable outcomes. In fact, there are arguments sometimes you're not going to get an equitable outcome for the most efficient outcome. So the titles sometimes are a bit gamed with, Willem. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's an interesting one. And as I said, Wales and Scotland have things called wellness commissions. And I'm still trying to work out if they actually do productivity type things as well or not. Yeah.
Or how much whiskey is involved in for the wellness? Xiaowen again?
Sorry, a follow-up question. Because you mentioned just now that they can ask the Productivity Commission to look into something. Who are the they? The certain industry can request, like say, to the Productivity Commission, or only the Chief Minister or whoever they are sitting under can request?
Most commissions can do one of two things. They can do, obviously, those referred to them by government, And sometimes, in turn, governments will ask something to be done because a number of players in the broader community have agitated for an issue. So, for example, if a group of industry bodies, a group of NGOs were concerned about a particular issue, it might be a comment and say to the government, what are you going to do? They might say, well, we'll give it to our Productivity Commission. We want them to examine the issue. Once we've got that evidence, then we'll talk to you about what the final outcome might be. So that can be one of the ways in which they can do it. Many, but not all agencies also have the power to do their own inquiries as well. Now that one, as you just yes, some politicians will kind of go, oh, not very comfortable with that, and other places are a bit more comfortable with it. So yes, some of them actually have the capacity to go, interesting, but we want to look at this topic. We're going to do our own thing. That is as a politician, that is a braver move. And then there are hybrids. So sometimes you can do your own thing, but we've got to tick it off first, So, but typically, that's it's a much more reform-minded politician that will sort of say, go and do the things that you think are important. I trust you to do that. It does happen, and sometimes it produces results people didn't expect. Yeah.
What kind of experts do you wish for in a commission?
A good question. I think you want a mix of people. You don't just want people purely from an economics background. There's some that I think are fairly straightforward. You need a mix of economics background. I think you will, and both classical and I would say increasingly more so those in areas like behavioural economics, because we realise those things are increasingly important. I wouldn't populate it all with economists and lawyers, but I would look for people, a bit of a mix. I would want people that have come from particular policy domains as well. The important thing is also you need to create in the teams that do the reviews in-house. They need to be adept at moving from one completely different topic to another one. Today we're looking at, is it viable to establish a submarine berth harbour, on next month we'll be doing an inquiry into, how do we put a price on native wildlife? That could be consent. So you want people who are intellectually quite interested in doing very different topics.
And hopefully with a sense of practicalities. Right?
And that's the other element of it too, as well. Evidence-based, but also avoiding that problem of going, you should fix this. You need to, because you are the people that are meant to say, here are your options to fix it, and here's how it's going to work, as I mentioned before. So yes, practicality is very important. So it means both for the commissioners, but also the staff, you need that mix. I'd personally like people who've worked in places like this, as well as some knowledge of how government works. I think they're the ones that are going to be able to pull the different elements together. Yeah.
I have one last question, which is about 15 minutes. That's how does the commission relate to the cabinet and members of the cabinet? How many people do they have to listen to?
They traditionally, in terms of how they relate to cabinet, it's through their minister, as opposed to reporting directly to the cabinet as a whole. That said, you would be expected, for example, if you were doing an inquiry into energy issues, that you would want to be working with the Energy Minister's office. First of all, no surprises. You should never run an inquiry where people are kind of, I didn't know you were going to look at this issue. I didn't know what the terms of reference. That is a recipe for a very poor outcome and resistance. And also, although your findings are independent, it's still appropriate, I think, often to say to government, this is where we are likely to land with our conclusions. Do you have anything we need to take into account before we finalise where we land as well. So that requires engagement not only with senior public servants, but also with ministers as well.
Just thinking on a normal day,
Yeah.
the commission sits there, and then you have, I don't know, 12 cabinet ministers, and then you have their boss, the prime minister. Can they say no to somebody? You know, or otherwise they'll have too many bosses. You know. So do you need a very strong prime minister? So maybe my point.
I think you always need a reform-minded prime minister or treasurer to run these and to make them work. We talked before about when there are contentious issues, best usually tried to resolve behind closed doors. I suspect, because none of us are cabinet ministers, that when cabinet ministers have those arguments, they do them behind their own closed doors that we don't know. We just know that the inquiry is on or off as well. Yeah, it's not that easy sometimes to do it, especially if you're going to come up with hard options or difficult questions. So you need to be, the next best thing is to make sure people know this is coming, and to also show them why you've reached that conclusion and the basis, that it wasn't just a subjective decision. The evidence points in this direction.
I suppose very often you get dragged into the political struggles, even within the cabinet, I'm sure, right?
A friend of mine once said, "Oh, those things are like, you know, they happen out on Mount Olympus. The doors close,
Okay.
and we mere mortals only know when once the cabinet room reopens and a decision has been made, you know." So yeah, I think that does happen like that.
More questions? Yeah, 10, 15 minutes.
If not,
No?
sure, everyone. Well, thank you for coming.
Yeah. It's I mean it's quite a, to me personally, it's quite a interesting, almost epiphanic approach, using this way of approaching it, because then I do see in our work itself that all the bits are there, and there is back to the question, how much do you centralize in research and taking orders and so on. So the flow of information up and down, and how do you work with other agencies and other departments, and why should they work with you, and so on and so forth. So to get past the silo working systems of most agencies, you sort of have someone at the top, a real commission, like an imperial commission, right? The emperor says, you act on my behalf, and then you go. But if that status is not given to the commission, then it becomes an alternative, well, an in-house consulting firm kind of thing. You know?
It needs to be more than an in-house consulting firm, but it also needs to consult extensively. You should not go off once you've got your terms of reference and just let's go and do a desk review, let's look at the literature, let's write our results. You have to spend a lot of time and wear a lot of shoe leather out, talking to a lot of people. And I think that's because every problem, there are a lot of players. And I've done quite a few reviews in many different areas for governments, franchising law, procurement, policies, regional development. And every now and then, someone you're talking to will just make a throwaway comment and you'll go, I did not know that, you know, and that is a really important issue. Or someone will just say, throw an idea at, and they'll say, but no one thought it was important. And you look at it and you go, that is a really, really important idea. Just the fact that it hasn't been aired doesn't mean it doesn't count. It's actually really important. So the more you can talk to people, test your ideas, and also have an extensive group of people that you can come back and test your ideas to. I think that's the other one where you can actually say to people, we're thinking of recommending this. What do you think of that idea? Will it work? Have I missed something? Is this viable? That's really important too, you know? This is a contest of ideas in the positive way. Here's an idea, pull it apart. A bit like, you know, for those with an academic background, of course, you know, doing a research higher degree proposal, you know, here's my project and here's what I think the results are, and then the panel usually pulling it apart. But at least the end of it, you kind of go, well, it's a more solid idea, even though it probably hurt me to get pulled apart, but, you know, it's been worthwhile. Or a peer review of a journal article or an output. It is actually about getting a better outcome and finding weaknesses. Yeah.
At the same, I can't help feeling that it's somehow a damage control mechanism, in that in the perfect case, the government apparatus shouldn't need this because they will be full of hierarchy of experts and politicians who know what they want. And then, but even if it's a commission, when the commission comes in, it has to gather information, it has to gather it from the government apparatus itself. And if the expertise, the hierarchy of expertise isn't there, the commission has its work cut out for it, right?
We're all imperfect creatures. We're all humans.
Yeah, yeah.
And so no system will be self-evident, but the best systems are ones that kind of acknowledge we're not perfect. So we put these things sit on the sidelines to make sure that we try and do our job better, whether it be an ombudsman to make sure the administration of the public sector is done better, whether it be a director of public prosecutions to ensure that the police don't abuse their powers or whatever. We create these as we go along. So I think of it as a way, in a perfect world, departments would always have the best policies, but they're busy doing a lot of other things too.
Don't get me wrong. I think damage control is what we do most of the time in any apparatus, right? Yeah. Anything else before we tie up for the evening? Yeah, we better not let her get started. Yes. Anything else? No? Otherwise, we'll just thank Michael Schaefer and hope that he'll come visit us again.
Absolutely.
Thank you for coming.